Asia was not waiting for Homo sapiens. Long before our species entered its forests, plains, and islands, other human populations had already crossed immense distances, endured unfamiliar climates, and disappeared, leaving behind scattered bones, stone tools, and faint traces in living DNA. The cold fact is that we arrived in a continent already marked by lost branches of humanity. The first humans in Asia were not us who reached the east before Homo sapiens. Before Homo sapiens became the familiar human presence across Asia, the continent had already passed through long cycles of cold, warmth, dryness, and rain. Its shape was recognizable, but never fixed. Northern grasslands expanded and contracted. Deserts shifted at their margins. Rivers cut new paths through valleys, while forests moved with changing monsoons. Along the southern edge, falling seas sometimes exposed broad plains where water lies today, joining regions that would later become separate islands. When the seas rose again, those plains narrowed or vanished, taking ancient coastlines and any fragile traces upon them beneath the water. To imagine the first human movement into the east, we must therefore put aside the modern map. The routes available in one age could become barriers in another. A valley might offer water and animals for many generations, then become colder or drier. A grassland corridor could open between forests, only to close again as rainfall returned. High plateaus demanded different forms of endurance from low tropical basins, while winter cold in the north created pressures unlike those found near equatorial forests. Seasonal change could alter not only where food was found, but when movement was possible. Mountains, plateaus, deep river systems, and stretches of sea divided Asia into many different worlds. No single environment defined the continent, and no single journey could have explained every early human presence within it. This matters because the story did not begin with people who looked exactly like us. Homo sapiens is the only surviving human species, so the word human now seems to point naturally toward ourselves. In the deeper past, however, the human family contained other populations with their own histories. Some had moved far beyond Africa before our species spread widely through Eurasia. They reached unfamiliar landscapes, remained in some regions for long spans, and left evidence that is often too incomplete to reveal who they were. Their presence does not mean that Asia was continuously occupied everywhere, or that one population crossed the whole continent in a single expansion. Groups may have advanced during favourable periods, become separated, disappeared locally, or been followed much later by others. Some may have remained near reliable rivers. Others may have followed animals across open country or moved gradually through connected habitats without any awareness that they were entering a new continent. The beginning was probably not one clean line moving eastward, but a shifting pattern of arrivals and absences across immense distances. The land itself has made that pattern difficult to recover. Bones survive only under particular conditions, and warm, wet soils can destroy them. Open camps may be scattered by rivers, buried beneath sediment, or removed by erosion. Coastal places, which could once have offered water, plants, shellfish, and travel routes, may now lie far beyond the present shore. Even when stone objects remain, they usually preserve only a narrow moment, a material selected, struck, used, and left behind. They do not preserve a name, a face, or a clear account of where the maker's ancestors came from. This is why an apparently empty region cannot always be treated as a region where nobody lived. It may instead be a place where evidence failed to survive, has not yet been found, or remains hidden under landscapes that no longer resemble their ancient form. Asia before Homo sapiens was therefore neither empty nor fully known. It was a changing continent capable of opening paths, closing them, isolating populations, and erasing much of what they left behind. Before we can ask who first reached the East, we must recognize that their world was not simply an earlier version of ours. It was a moving geography in which human beginnings could appear, separate, and disappear. Because Homo sapiens is the only human species still alive, it is easy to treat our name as though it were another word for humanity itself. The deeper past does not allow that simplicity. Our species is one surviving branch within a much older human family, and many other populations existed before us. Some were closely related to our ancestors. Others followed separate evolutionary paths for very long periods. They were not incomplete versions of modern people waiting to become us. Each population inherited a body shaped by its own ancestry, and lived within conditions that could preserve, separate, or eventually remove it. When researchers describe an ancient human presence in Asia, they are therefore not automatically describing Homo sapiens. They may be describing a population known from bones, another recognized mainly from stone objects, or an unnamed group whose identity remains uncertain because the evidence is too limited. The distinction matters most when we ask who first reached the East. If every human trace is quietly imagined as belonging to people like ourselves, the earliest chapters of Asian history are pulled forward in time, and much of their real complexity disappears. The continent had been entered by members of the human family before our species became widespread there. Yet those early inhabitants should not be pictured as one uniform people moving steadily from west to east. Human evolution did not produce a single line in which one form vanished exactly when another appeared. Different populations could exist during overlapping periods, occupy distant environments, and retain combinations of traits that do not fit comfortably into a simple ladder. A skull might resemble one known group in certain features and differ in others. Teeth can preserve patterns that suggest biological relationships without revealing the complete appearance of the individual. A fragmentary jaw or limb bone may show that a human relative was present while leaving its precise place in the family uncertain. Scientific names are useful because they organize evidence, but the ancient populations themselves were not divided by the clean borders of modern labels. Variation existed within populations, and separation over many generations could produce differences that accumulated gradually rather than appearing all at once. Asia made this process especially difficult to reduce to a single story. Its enormous distances and sharply different environments could divide groups from one another. A population in a northern river valley might face conditions unlike those of people living near southern forests or island margins. Contact could be interrupted when climate altered a corridor, when deserts expanded, or when sea levels separated land that had once been connected. Small populations could become isolated, develop distinctive features, and later disappear without leaving enough remains for us to identify them confidently. Others might meet related groups again, exchange genes, or be absorbed into larger populations. These possibilities do not prove what happened at every location, but they explain why the surviving record may contain mixtures, uncertain classifications, and traces that seem to belong to people no longer visible as a separate population. The beginning of humanity in Asia is therefore larger than the beginning of Homo sapiens in Asia. Our arrival was one event within a history already in progress. Before faces like ours appeared widely across the East, other human bodies had already responded to cold plains, seasonal forests, high ground, river corridors, and changing coastlines. They carried older ancestries into landscapes that could reshape their descendants, but most of their individual lives have vanished beyond recovery. What remains is not a complete sequence of ancestors leading neatly toward us. It is a broken record of parallel lives, separated populations, and evolutionary branches whose names may be clearer than their boundaries. To understand who reached the East first, we must begin by accepting that the word human once described a world with more than one way of being human. The oldest human presence in Asia is not preserved as a clear procession of recognizable people. It appears instead as scattered objects, isolated bones, uncertain dates, and long empty spaces between discoveries. This creates a quiet paradox. If members of the human family had entered parts of the continent very early, then countless lives must once have unfolded there. Individuals were born, grew, searched for food, carried stone, crossed rivers, and died. Yet almost none of those lives can be seen directly. What remains may be a few sharp-edged stones in an ancient layer, a tooth recovered from a cave, or a fragment of bone whose shape can be compared with other finds, but cannot restore an entire population. The first inhabitants are therefore both present and absent. Their existence can sometimes be demonstrated, while their identity remains beyond confident recognition. Stone tools are among the most durable signs of this lost world. They can survive conditions that destroy wood, plant fibers, skin, and bone. When their surfaces and archaeological settings support a human origin, they show that someone selected raw material and altered it deliberately, but the tool does not preserve the hand that held it. Similar methods can be used by different populations, while one population may produce different objects when stone quality, purpose, or local tradition changes. A tool can place human activity within a landscape without revealing whether its maker belonged to a known branch or to a population for which no diagnostic fossil has yet been found. The beginning of the Asian story can thus be older than the oldest face we are able to reconstruct. Bones seem more personal, but they create other difficulties. Fossilization is rare, and most bodies disappear completely. Of the few remains that survive, many are incomplete. A single tooth can contain valuable anatomical information, yet several related populations may share some of its features. A skull fragment may preserve a mixture of traits, some resembling one group and others resembling another. Damage, age, sex, individual variation, and the small number of available specimens can all complicate comparison. The scientific name attached to a fossil is not always a final answer. It may represent the best explanation currently supported by limited material, open to revision when another jaw, skull, or genetic sample is discovered. Geography deepens the uncertainty. Asia is too large for evidence from one valley, cave, or island to describe the whole continent. The earliest known occupation in one region may have little connection to the first settlement of another. Between excavated sites lie forests, river basins, dry interiors, mountains, submerged shelves, and cities built over ancient ground. Researchers can investigate only a tiny fraction of these spaces. Even well-studied places preserve selected moments rather than continuous histories. A layer without tools may mark an absence of people, but it may also reflect erosion, poor preservation, or activity that left no durable remains. Silence in the ground has more than one possible meaning. This is why the question of who reached the East first cannot be answered merely by finding the oldest dated object. Age is only one element. Archaeologists must also ask whether an object was moved after burial, whether the surrounding layer is secure, whether marks were made intentionally, and whether human remains can be associated with the same occupation. Different forms of evidence may point in the same direction without belonging to the same individuals or even the same population. At the origin of humanity's Asian history stands not one complete ancestor, but a broken archive. Its missing pages are not decorative gaps that imagination may freely fill. They are limits that must remain visible. The first eastern inhabitants left enough to show that our species entered a world with a deep human past, but not enough to tell us, at the beginning, exactly how many kinds of people had already called that world home. A stone tool can remain in the ground long after almost everything around it has disappeared. Bone can soften, crack, dissolve, or be carried away. Wood rots. Plant fibers vanish. Skin leaves no trace. Footprints collapse unless they are sealed under unusually favorable conditions. A shelter made from branches may survive for a season and then return to the soil. Stone behaves differently. Once struck into a durable shape, it can endure burial, pressure, cold, heat, and long changes in the surrounding landscape. This difference helps explain why the earliest human trail across Asia often appears without bodies or faces. Archaeologists may recover flakes, cores, or heavier pieces shaped by repeated blows, yet find no fossil remains nearby. The tools show that human hands were present, but they do not immediately reveal which human population made them. Their survival creates a record that is both valuable and incomplete. It preserves action more readily than identity. A flake removed from a larger stone may record the direction and force of a strike. Several related pieces can show that stone was worked at the location rather than broken elsewhere and transported by water. Wear, fractures, and the position of artifacts within sediment may help researchers judge whether an object was used, moved, or disturbed after burial. None of this turns the stone into a complete biography. The maker's height, face, ancestry, and social relationships remain absent. Even the purpose of a tool may not always be certain, because one sharp edge could serve more than one task. The most cautious interpretation begins with what the object can support, then stops before imagination replaces evidence. This is especially important when looking for the beginning of human presence in the East. A very old collection of tools may stand alone, separated from recognizable fossils by immense distances or by layers of time. It can establish that a tool-making human relative reached a region, while leaving open whether that population belonged to a familiar branch, an early form not yet clearly defined, or a group whose bones have never been found. Similar-looking technologies do not guarantee that the same people carried them across the continent. Simple methods of striking stone could be learned, retained, or rediscovered by different populations facing similar needs. Raw material also shaped the result. Fine stone could break into controlled sharp flakes, while rougher local rock might produce heavier and less regular forms. Variation in tools may therefore reflect available material and immediate use, not only biological difference. The opposite mistake is also possible. Tools that resemble one another can hide changes in the bodies and populations that produce them. A practical method may continue across many generations even while people become separated or meet other groups. Archaeological similarity is not the same as genetic identity. The Asian record begins, in many places, with this uneasy distance between evidence and recognition. Stone can outlive the hand by an almost unimaginable span, but durability does not preserve everything that mattered about the hand. It cannot tell us whether the maker was born nearby or arrived through a corridor opened by climate. It cannot reveal whether a small population remained for centuries or passed through during a favourable interval. It cannot show whether the people who made one group of artefacts ever encountered those who left another far away. The beginning of the human story in Asia is therefore visible first as repeated contact between bodies and landscapes. Stone selected from a riverbed, carried across ground, struck, used, and abandoned. Behind those surviving objects stood living populations, but the path from artifact to identity is not direct. Before fossils provide clearer faces, the oldest trail is often a trail of stone, asking us to accept presence without pretending that presence already gives us a name. On the southern edge of the Chinese Loess Plateau, layers of wind-blown earth preserve a record that has changed how researchers think about the first human movements into Eastern Asia. The place is known as Shangchen. It does not offer a skull, a jaw, or even a single tooth that can be assigned confidently to the people who passed through. What it offers instead is stone. Across a long sequence of ancient soils and Loess deposits, researchers identified worked pieces lying within layers formed at different times. The collection includes flakes, cores, and other pieces whose fracture patterns were interpreted as the result of deliberate stoneworking rather than ordinary natural breakage. The oldest of these layers has been dated to more than 2 million years ago through the magnetic history preserved in the sediments. If that interpretation is correct, tool-making members of the human family had reached central China remarkably early, long before Homo sapiens existed. The importance of Shangchen lies not only in its age, but also in its distance from the African landscapes where the earliest members of our broader lineage evolved. Reaching the Loess Plateau did not require one dramatic march across an empty continent. It may instead have resulted from generations of gradual movement, with populations following suitable habitats through western and central Eurasia. Valleys, open woodland, grasslands, and reliable water could have created temporary corridors. When climate changed, those corridors might narrow, move, or disappear. A group did not need to understand the scale of Asia to move farther into it. Each generation may have occupied ground only somewhat beyond the range familiar to the one before it. Over long periods, small changes in location could carry human populations across distances no individual ever intended to cross. Yet the stones at Shangchen do not reveal which population completed that movement. No human fossils were recovered from the artifact-bearing layers described in the original study. This absence prevents the tools from being attached securely to a particular species. Homo erectus may seem like an obvious possibility because fossils assigned to that broad group are known elsewhere in Asia, but a reasonable possibility is not the same as direct identification. The makers could have belonged to an early population related to later Asian humans, or to a branch that left too little skeletal evidence to receive a confident name. The safest conclusion is narrower. Someone capable of deliberately shaping stone was present in this part of China at an unexpectedly early time. The sequence also suggests that Shangchen was not necessarily the trace of one brief visit. Artifacts occur in several separated layers, with sediments between them representing long intervals. This pattern may indicate repeated occupation of the wider landscape under different environmental conditions. It does not prove that one continuous population remained there throughout the entire sequence. Groups could have arrived, withdrawn, disappeared locally, and been followed by others. Similar tools in different layers cannot by themselves tell us whether the makers were descendants of earlier inhabitants or newcomers using comparable methods. The landscape recorded presence more clearly than ancestry. Shangchen therefore brings us closer to the beginning of humanity in the East, while making the central mystery more visible. The tools push human activity deep into the Asian past, but the people behind them remain without faces. They reached a region far from the earliest known homeland of the human family, adapted well enough to leave repeated traces, and then disappeared from the record except for stones held in ancient earth. The discovery does not give the first Eastern inhabitants a final name. It shows instead that the journey toward Asia had already begun before the fossil record allows us to see clearly who was making it. The oldest stone tools in Asia do not carry the names of their makers. They preserve a physical act, but not a biological identity. A flake removed from a core can show that someone understood how stone would fracture. Repeated blows may reveal planning, control, and familiarity with local material. A cluster of objects can indicate that work took place at a particular location. Yet none of these observations tells us what the toolmaker's face looked like, how large the body was, or which branch of the human family the individual belonged to. Archaeologists can often reconstruct the making of an object more confidently than they can identify the person who made it. This limitation begins with the nature of classification. Stone technologies are organized by their shapes, manufacturing methods, and patterns of use. Human fossils are classified through anatomy, and ancient populations may also be studied through surviving proteins or DNA. These forms of evidence do not always occur together. A layer rich in tools may contain no human remains. A cave may preserve teeth or bones without any tools that can be securely linked to them. Even when artifacts and fossils are found near one another, researchers must determine whether they entered the ground during the same period. Water, animals, erosion, burrowing, or later occupation can move objects and bring materials of different ages together. Association must be demonstrated rather than assumed. The same caution applies when similar tools are found at distant sites. A familiar stone form does not necessarily mark the movement of one population across Asia. Different human groups could produce comparable objects because they face similar practical problems and worked with stone in similar ways. A sharp edge is useful regardless of the ancestry of the person holding it. Simple reduction methods may also remain effective for long periods, giving people little reason to abandon them. Technology can continue while populations change, separate, or meet others. For this reason, an archaeological tradition cannot automatically be treated as a biological species. The reverse is equally important. One human population could use more than one method of making tools. Available rock differed from place to place. River cobbles encouraged certain choices, while fine-grained stone allowed others. Tasks also varied. Cutting soft tissue, breaking hard material, scraping a surface, or producing a heavy edge did not require identical forms. A population entering a new environment might alter its technology without undergoing any biological change. Differences between assemblages can therefore reflect raw material, function, learning, mobility, preservation, or time. They do not always reveal a boundary between kinds of humans. At the beginning of the Asian record, these uncertainties become especially large because both artifacts and fossils are scarce. A small collection may represent repeated visits, a brief occupation, or material disturbed from its original position. An isolated object can be important, but it must be interpreted through its geological setting and relation to surrounding deposits. Dating the layer establishes when the object was buried or formed within that context. Yet even a secure age cannot supply a missing skeleton. The result is a trail without faces. It confirms that tool-making humans reach parts of the East, sometimes at remarkably early periods, while leaving their precise identity unresolved. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is an honest boundary between what survives and what can be concluded. Stone provides evidence of presence, skill, and contact with a landscape. It cannot preserve every difference among the populations that touched it. The first human history of Asia therefore begins with an unusual imbalance. We can sometimes see what ancient hands did long before we can know whose hands they were. The movement of early humans beyond Africa did not begin as a direct journey toward China, Java, or the islands of Southeast Asia. It began across connected landscapes where one region passed gradually into another, through the Levant, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the broad territories farther east. Rivers, open woodland, grasslands and lake margins could offer food and water during favourable periods, while colder or drier intervals could narrow the same routes or close them completely. No population needed to understand the full size of Eurasia. Movement could happen slowly, as one generation lived somewhat beyond the familiar range of the generation before it. Over many thousands of years, such small changes in distance could carry human populations far from the African environments in which the human family first evolved. One of the clearest early windows onto this expansion comes from Dmanisi, in the Caucasus region of present-day Georgia. Fossils and stone tools found there show that members of the genus Homo were living outside Africa very early in the Pleistocene. The importance of Dmanisi lies in the unusual number of remains preserved at one place. Skulls, jaws, teeth, and parts of skeletons reveal several individuals rather than one isolated fragment. Their anatomy retained features considered early in the history of Homo, and their brains were smaller than those of later humans. Yet these people had already reached a region far beyond Africa. Their presence challenged the older expectation that only humans with large brains, highly elaborate tools, or bodies close to our own could enter Eurasia. Dmanisi does not prove that one population continued without interruption all the way to Eastern Asia. It shows something more limited but still important. An early human threshold had already been crossed. Members of Homo could survive in environments outside Africa, including places with stronger seasonal change. From this western Eurasian doorway, later populations may have moved through several routes during different periods. Some could follow open habitats north of major mountain systems. Others may have moved along southern corridors where rivers and vegetation remained available. Climate repeatedly altered these possibilities. Grasslands could connect distant regions for a time, then retreat as forests, deserts, or colder conditions expanded. Human movement was therefore unlikely to be one continuous wave. Populations could advance, become isolated, disappear locally, or be followed much later by different groups using similar landscapes. The fossils from Dmanisi are often discussed in relation to Homo erectus, but their classification remains part of a wider scientific debate. Some researchers emphasize similarities with early African Homo, while others include them within a broad and variable Homo erectus. This uncertainty is useful because it prevents a scientific label from becoming a false certainty. Ancient populations did not exist inside the clean categories later created to organize fossils. Individuals within one population could differ noticeably, and anatomical changes could develop gradually across distance and time. At the beginning of the Asian human story, Dmanisi stands near a western gateway rather than at the final eastern destination. It gives us faces where some older Asian sites provide mainly stone, but it cannot identify every population that later moved deeper into the continent. The people represented there show that early humans had already begun adapting to Eurasia before the human form known from later Asia became widespread. Beyond them lay plains, deserts, high ground, monsoon forests, and coastlines that would separate populations and shape them differently. The movement toward the east had begun, but the people making that movement were not yet one simple, uniform, or fully understood branch of humanity. Their descendants and related populations would enter new environments, become separated across great distances, and leave behind a record that remains incomplete. Farther east, the early human presence becomes more clearly associated with fossils commonly placed within Homo erectus, although the name covers a wide range of individuals separated by immense distances and long spans of time. In China, remains from places such as Zhoukudian became central to the history of paleoanthropology. Skulls, teeth, jaws, and other bones found there revealed humans with long, low cranial vaults, heavy brow regions, and brain sizes generally larger than those known from some earlier members of Homo. These features help define the broad anatomical picture of Asian Homo erectus, but the fossils did not represent a single moment or one unchanging population. The cave deposits accumulated over a long period, and later disturbance, excavation history, and the loss of many original fossils during the 20th century have complicated attempts to reconstruct every detail. What survives still shows that people related to Homo erectus occupied northern China repeatedly, living within environments that shifted between colder and milder conditions. Far to the south, Java preserves another major record. During periods of lower sea level, Java was connected more closely to the exposed plains of the Sunda Shelf, creating a larger western Indonesian landmass linked to mainland Southeast Asia. Rivers cross these plains, animals move through them, and human populations could follow suitable habitats toward the island region without crossing every stretch of water that exists today. Fossils from Sangiran, Trinil, and later sites along the Solo River demonstrate that Homo erectus lived in Java through a remarkable depth of time. Their presence was not one brief arrival at the edge of the world. It became a long Asian history shaped by changing rivers, volcanic landscapes, expanding grasslands, and repeated alterations of sea level. The bodies represented in China and Java share enough features to be grouped broadly under Homo erectus, yet they should not be imagined as identical people. Distance alone could reduce contact between populations. Climate and terrain could deepen separation, while local environments placed different pressures on survival and movement. Fossils from different periods also show variation in skull shape, thickness, and other anatomical details. Some differences may reflect gradual change through time, some may represent regional variation, and some may be influenced by the small and uneven fossil sample. The name Homo erectus is therefore useful, but it is not a promise that every individual from Africa, the Caucasus, China, and Java belong to one uniform population. It gathers related evidence into a broad framework while leaving room for disagreement about where one population ended and another began. This wider view changes the meaning of the journey east. Homo erectus was not simply an African traveller who reached Asia and remained unchanged. Populations became Asian through long residence within Asian environments. Generations were born far from the places their distant ancestors had left. They encountered monsoon cycles, cold northern winters, volcanic regions, changing coastlines, and animal communities unlike those farther west. Over time, the continent was no longer merely a route. It became the setting in which distinct regional histories developed. Yet even this extensive record cannot explain every early tool site or every later fossil that resists classification. Homo erectus is the strongest named presence across much of the early Asian record, but the oldest stones without bones and the unusual humans found in later periods warn against turning that name into a universal answer. The East had begun to hold durable human populations, but their full diversity was still hidden. What appears from a distance as one successful species may, at closer range, contain regional histories that fossils preserve only unevenly. The deeper the record becomes, the less safely one label can stand for every human who crossed, settled, and changed within Asia. The name Homo erectus is useful because it gives researchers a way to discuss fossils that share a broad pattern across Africa and Asia, but the name can also create an illusion of sameness. A skull from Java, another from northern China, and an early individual from western Eurasia may all be placed within the same species even though they were separated by great distances, changing environments, and very long periods of time. They were not members of one small community spread across a map. They belonged to populations that could lose contact, develop regional differences, and experience separate histories. Some features remained recognizable across this wider record, including long, low skulls, strong brow regions, and bodies suited to walking efficiently over land. Yet the details varied. Cranial shape, bone thickness, brain size, teeth, and facial structure did not remain perfectly constant. Part of that variation may reflect differences between males and females, age, or ordinary diversity within populations. Part may reflect change through time or adaptation to different environments. Because the fossil sample is incomplete, researchers cannot always separate these causes confidently. The oldest known individuals do not necessarily resemble later Asian fossils in every detail, and people living in Java need not have developed in exactly the same way as populations farther north. Tropical lowlands, volcanic river systems, seasonal grasslands, and colder northern habitats placed different demands on bodies and behavior. Geography also affected contact. Mountain ranges, dry interiors, changing coastlines, and expanding forests could divide populations for many generations. When routes reopened, groups might meet again, but isolation could also continue until local populations disappeared. Under such conditions, the broad category Homo erectus may contain several regional stories rather than one unchanged lineage moving steadily through Asia. This does not mean that every difference deserves a separate species name. Fossils are often fragmentary, and the natural variation within an ancient population is difficult to measure when only a few individuals survive. Dividing every unusual skull into a new species could make the past seem more certain and more crowded than the evidence allows. Combining all fossils under one label can create the opposite error, hiding real diversity and treating Asia as a place where human evolution stood still. A careful interpretation must remain between these extremes. Homo erectus was clearly one of the most successful and enduring human forms in the early Asian record, but success did not require biological uniformity. Long residence across the continent gave populations time to become locally distinct while retaining enough shared anatomy for researchers to recognize a wider relationship. This is why Homo erectus cannot safely answer every question raised by the earliest tools in China or every later fossil with an unfamiliar mixture of traits. Some remains may belong within its broad variation, while others may represent populations with different ancestry. Without bones directly associated with the oldest tool layers, the connection remains an informed possibility rather than a demonstrated identity. The first humans in the East were therefore not necessarily one people arriving once and spreading without change. What looks like continuity from a distance may conceal replacement, renewed migration, local survival, and periods when a region held no detectable population at all. Similar anatomy does not prove constant contact, just as anatomical difference does not always prove complete separation. Asia may have received several movements, preserved some populations for immense spans, divided others, and allowed regional histories to develop beyond the reach of surviving evidence. Homo erectus gives the early Asian world its clearest enduring human presence, but the label marks the beginning of a more difficult question about how much hidden diversity can exist inside a name created from scattered bones. Northern Asia did not offer early human populations a stable cold world. It offered a world in which cold, dryness, wind, vegetation, and animal movement changed repeatedly. During harsher intervals, open steppe and grassland could spread across regions that had once supported more trees. Dust moved over exposed ground and accumulated in thick deposits. Water became less evenly available. Winters lengthened, and the distance between reliable places could grow. During milder intervals, woodland returned to some areas, rivers carried more water, and animals followed new patterns across the land. For people already living far from the African environments in which the human family first evolved, this instability mattered as much as low temperature itself. Survival depended not only on enduring cold days, but on living through seasons when food, water, shelter, and movement no longer remained where they had been before. Winter changes the meaning of a landscape. Plants that can be gathered in warm months disappear or become difficult to reach. Frozen ground limits digging. Rivers may become barriers in one season and pathways in another. Herd animals move, gather, or leave a region, and the predators following them also change their range. A place that supported repeated occupation during warmer months might become dangerous or empty when temperatures fell. Early humans in northern Asia, therefore, could not rely on one resource throughout the year. They had to respond to shifting opportunities, perhaps by changing where they stayed, what animals they used, which plants they sought, or when they crossed open country. Archaeology rarely preserves these decisions clearly. A layer of tools can show that people returned to a location, but it may not reveal whether they remained through winter or visited only during a favorable season. Cold conditions also affected the body directly, although fossils do not allow every response to be reconstructed. Heat is lost more quickly when wind crosses exposed skin, and maintaining body temperature requires energy. Food shortage, therefore, becomes more serious when the body must spend more energy simply remaining warm. Clothing, shelter, fire, movement, body proportions, and social cooperation could all influence survival, but their presence cannot be assumed at every early site. Organic coverings disappear easily, shelters may leave little trace, and evidence for controlled fire is uneven and sometimes disputed. The safest conclusion is not that every northern population possessed the same solutions, but that occupation of colder regions required some workable combination of behavior, physiology, and access to local resources. Dryness created another test. Open environments can make animal herds easier to observe, yet they can also spread water and plant foods across greater distances. Expanding deserts may close one route, while grassland opens another, farther north or south. Climate, therefore, did not act only as an enemy. It could create corridors as well as barriers. Periods of more open habitat may have helped some human populations move across parts of Eurasia, even while the same aridity made local survival more demanding. A corridor on a map was not necessarily a comfortable road. It was a temporary chain of livable places that could break when rainfall, rivers, or animal communities changed. This northern record brings the story back to the first humans in Asia. Reaching the east was not completed when a population crossed a geographical boundary. It had to be repeated through generations born into unfamiliar seasonal worlds. Some groups may have endured long enough to leave several occupations. Others may have withdrawn or vanished when conditions changed beyond what their population size, knowledge, or access to resources could support. The cold and dry north did not simply receive human beings. It filtered them, separated them, and helped decide which branches of humanity would leave a visible trace. Southern Asia presented a different test from the cold and open regions farther north. Here, heat alone did not define the environment. Rainfall could arrive in powerful seasonal cycles. Rivers could swell beyond their banks. Forests could thicken, and paths through low ground could disappear beneath water or vegetation. During drier intervals, woodlands opened and grasslands expanded in some regions, creating wider movement corridors for animals and people. When wetter conditions returned, those corridors might narrow, while river systems shifted and dense vegetation divided the landscape into smaller zones. Early human populations moving through this world faced not one permanent tropical setting, but a changing mosaic of forest, open woodland, floodplain, swamp, and river edge. Each habitat offered resources, yet each also limited what could be seen, carried, preserved, or reached. In a dense forest, food could be abundant without being predictable. Fruit ripened at different times and in different places. Edible plants might be scattered rather than concentrated. Animals could be harder to observe than herds on open grassland, and movement through tangled vegetation could be slow. Heat and humidity increased the speed at which meat spoiled and organic materials decayed. Rain softened soil, disturbed surfaces, and carried objects into new positions. Streams that provided water could become dangerous during seasonal floods. A place that appeared rich during one part of the year might offer far less during another. Living in such conditions required attention to local cycles, but the archaeological record rarely preserves how early populations acquired or transmitted that knowledge. Stone tools remain, while wooden implements, baskets, coverings, and plant foods usually disappear. Rivers were especially important because they could unite and divide the southern landscape at the same time. Their banks offered water, stone, plants, and access to animals. Valleys could guide movement through regions where dense vegetation made travel elsewhere difficult. Yet large rivers could shift course, cut away old camps, or bury them beneath deep sediment. Floodplains created fertile habitats, but they also erased the surfaces on which people had lived. Much of the earliest human history near tropical waterways may therefore have been destroyed or hidden, leaving isolated finds that seem separated by empty distances. The absence of evidence in a forested basin does not necessarily mean that people avoided it. Preservation and discovery are both more difficult where moisture, vegetation, erosion, and later sediment conceal the ancient ground. The bodies of early humans also met pressures different from those of the north. Remaining warm was rarely the central problem, but losing heat through activity, finding dependable water, avoiding injury, and obtaining enough food across seasonal changes could still limit survival. Tropical environments supported many species, yet biological richness did not guarantee easy human occupation. Useful plants might require knowledge of preparation. Animals could be dispersed, dangerous, nocturnal, or difficult to pursue. Insects and disease may have added further pressures, although direct evidence for their effects on specific ancient populations is limited. We should therefore avoid imagining the tropics either as a permanent garden or as an impassable green wall. They were complex environments in which some habitats may have been more accessible than others. This southern world reshaped the meaning of human expansion into Asia. Reaching a river valley or woodland did not mean that every nearby forest was occupied in the same way. Populations could follow open patches, coastlines, and waterways while using dense forest margins selectively. As climate changed, those margins moved. Groups might become separated when wet forests expanded, then reconnect when drier landscapes returned. Their survival depended on learning landscapes where abundant resources were never evenly distributed. The beginning of humanity in southern Asia was therefore written through repeated adjustments to water, vegetation, and seasonal uncertainty. Long before Homo sapiens entered these regions, other humans were already being tested by an environment that could appear generous, conceal its resources, and remove much of the evidence they left behind. High plateaus, inland deserts, and changing coastlines made the human occupation of Asia less like one eastward migration and more like a sequence of openings and closures. The Tibetan Plateau illustrates the difficulty clearly. Thin air, cold nights, strong winds, and limited plant growth made high ground demanding even when valleys below were more hospitable. Yet evidence from Baishia Karst Cave shows that an archaic human population related to the Denisovans occupied the plateau long before Homo sapiens became established there. This does not mean that every part of the plateau was continuously inhabited or that one population mastered the entire highland region. Caves, sheltered valleys, and nearby animal resources may have made some locations usable, while broad exposed areas remained difficult. Occupation could be repeated without being permanent, and generations living near the plateau's margins may have moved upward during favourable periods before withdrawing when conditions changed. Because open highland camps preserve poorly, the surviving cave record may reveal only a small and uneven portion of that history. Farther west, and through the interior, deserts created another kind of instability. The dry regions visible today were not always equally dry. Rainfall shifted, lakes expanded and contracted, and grasslands sometimes entered areas that would later become barren. During wetter intervals, chains of water, vegetation, and animal life could connect regions that otherwise seemed separated. When aridity returned, the same route could break into isolated refuges surrounded by ground that was difficult to cross. A population moving through such a corridor might reach farther east, become trapped in a shrinking habitat, or disappear locally when water and food declined. Another group could enter the same region much later, leaving tools that resembled the earlier occupation without necessarily descending directly from it. The southern coast added a third pattern. During colder periods, sea level fell and exposed wide areas of the continental shelf, especially around Southeast Asia. Mainland rivers extended across plains that are now submerged, and some present-day islands became parts of a much larger landmass known as Sunderland. These exposed lowlands could support movement toward Java and other regions at the edge of the shelf. When seas rose, coastlines moved inland, plains were drowned, and populations could become separated on islands or compressed into smaller territories. Not every island was connected even at low sea level, so water remained a boundary in parts of the region. The geography did not simply alternate between open and closed. It created different degrees of connection, from broad land corridors to narrow coastal routes and water gaps that may have limited movement. These repeated changes help explain why the first human history of Asia should not be imagined as one population spreading steadily until it filled the continent. A favourable climate could allow expansion across grassland or exposed coastal plain. A later shift could divide the descendants of that expansion into northern, inland, southern, or island populations. Some might remain long enough to develop regional anatomical differences. Others might vanish, be replaced, or meet newcomers entering through a reopened route. Similar environments could be occupied more than once by people with different ancestry, while related populations could become so separated that their later fossils no longer looked identical. The East was reached through many landscapes that did not remain available at the same time. Plateaus filtered movement vertically, deserts opened and closed interior passages, and seas repeatedly redrew the southern map. At the origin of Asia's human story, geography did more than provide a background. It divided generations, preserved some branches, erased others, and turned expansion into a history of repeated beginnings, rather than a single journey completed once. Stone tools are often arranged into types, traditions, and technological systems, but these categories do not map neatly onto different human species. A hand-sized core from one valley may look unlike a flake collection from another, yet the difference may begin with the stone itself. Fine-grained rock can fracture in predictable ways and allow thin, sharp edges to be produced. Coarser stone may break irregularly, encouraging heavier forms or shorter working sequences. River cobbles, volcanic rock, quartz, chert, and other materials each respond differently when struck. Early humans did not choose from an unlimited supply. They worked with what the landscape offered, sometimes carrying preferred stone over a distance, but often adapting their methods to local conditions. A simple-looking tool can therefore reflect difficult material rather than limited ability, while a carefully shaped object may partly reflect access to stone that was easier to control. Purpose also changes form. A sharp flake used briefly near an animal carcass need not resemble a durable edge intended for repeated work. Breaking bone, cutting flesh, scraping wood, opening plants, or striking another stone place different stresses on an object. Some tools may have been shaped in advance, while others were produced quickly and discarded after a short task. Archaeologists can study edge damage, microscopic wear, residues, and the sequence of flakes removed from a core, but preservation is uneven and many uses remain uncertain. What survives is usually only the stone portion of a larger technology. Wooden points, handles, bindings, baskets, digging sticks, and plant processing tools can disappear, leaving an assemblage that makes stone seem more central than it may have been in daily life. Tradition adds another layer. Tool-making skills are learned through observation, practice, and repeated contact with others. A useful method may continue because it is reliable, not because its makers are biologically incapable of producing something different. Nearby populations may share ideas, while isolated groups may preserve distinct habits, even if their bodies are closely related. A population entering a new region may alter its tools after encountering unfamiliar stone or different resources. Another population may keep a familiar method across generations because it continues to work. Similarity can therefore spread without large-scale migration, and difference can appear without the emergence of a new species. Time complicates the picture further. Two assemblages that look alike may be separated by a long interval, while very different toolkits may belong to populations living during overlapping periods. A method can persist after bodies have changed, and a new method can appear without a clear biological replacement. Archaeological sequence and evolutionary sequence are related, but they are not the same record. This is especially important in Asia, where older interpretations sometimes treated the absence of certain large cutting tools as evidence that Eastern populations were less capable than people farther west. The archaeological record no longer supports such a simple ranking. Asian sites reveal varied strategies, including careful core preparation, repeated selection of raw materials, small tools with useful edges, and technologies suited to local environments. Not every method appears everywhere, and no single sequence defines the whole continent. The absence of one tool form may reflect ecology, available rock, research history, or the needs of a population rather than a biological limit. At the beginning of the human story in the East, stone tools are best understood as records of decisions made within particular landscapes. They show that hands selected, tested, struck, carried, and used material, but they do not divide those hands automatically into separate species. To move from technology to human identity, researchers need support from fossils, dating, geography, and, where preservation allows, genetic or protein evidence. Without those connections, a tool tradition is a pattern of behavior, not a fossilized name. A stone tool can appear simple because its surviving shape is simple, but appearance is not a direct measure of the mind that produced it. A sharp flake may require only a few strikes, yet the maker still had to recognize suitable material, hold it securely, choose an angle, control force, and understand from experience how the stone would break. None of this proves a particular level of intelligence in the modern sense. It shows only that even a modest object can contain skills that are easy to overlook when the finished form is judged by sight alone. Experimental studies with modern participants also show that stoneworking involves coordination, practice, and learned control. While comparisons between technologies remain difficult because different tasks demand different kinds of skill, a tool made quickly for immediate use should not be ranked below a carefully shaped object without considering why each was produced. Efficiency can mean investing little time when a disposable edge is sufficient. It can also mean carrying a durable tool across a landscape where suitable stone is scarce. The correct solution depends on material, distance, purpose, and the knowledge shared within a group. This is why simple tools do not demonstrate simple minds. They may represent a practical response that worked well enough to be repeated across many generations. Complexity creates a different problem. A prepared core, a symmetrical cutting tool, or an object attached to a handle may reveal planning across several stages. It can suggest that the maker anticipated a future form and performed actions in a controlled order. Even then, technological complexity is not the same as modern thought. A demanding production sequence may reveal attention, memory, and practice skill without showing how the maker understood relationships, time, identity, or the unseen world. Those questions belong to a much wider human life than any single artifact can preserve. An elaborate object cannot tell us whether its maker possessed spoken language in a form comparable to ours, held beliefs about death, remembered distant ancestors, or understood personal identity as modern humans do. Those possibilities require evidence that stone alone rarely provides. Archaeology can examine production sequences and repeated choices, but it cannot safely turn them into detailed thoughts that were never recorded. The missing technologies make the problem even larger. Early humans almost certainly interacted with wood, plants, hides, bone, and other materials, but these survive far less often than stone. A collection that appears technologically narrow may be only the durable remainder of a much broader set of activities. A pointed wooden implement, a carrying container, a digging stick, or a fiber binding could change how people obtained food and moved through an environment, while leaving little or nothing for archaeologists to recover. The stone record may therefore understate both the variety of tools and the knowledge needed to produce them. This is especially relevant in Asia, where older ideas sometimes treated long-lasting stone forms as evidence of cultural or cognitive stagnation. Continuity does not necessarily mean that populations lacked imagination or learning. A reliable method may remain useful across changing climates, while innovation may occur in materials that disappear. Regional differences in preservation and excavation can also make one area appear poorer than another. At the beginning of humanity's Eastern history, tools should be read as limited records of decisions rather than as intelligence tests. Their form can reveal choices, constraints, and practiced movements. It cannot rank entire populations on a ladder from primitive to advanced. The people who reached Asia before Homo sapiens were not made mentally transparent by the stones they left behind, and the absence of elaborate objects does not give us permission to imagine empty minds. For much of the 20th century, the archaeological record of Eastern Asia was sometimes described as though it represented a technological backwater. Researchers compared the large, carefully shaped cutting tools known from parts of Africa, Europe, Western Asia, and South Asia with many Eastern assemblages dominated by cores, flakes, and smaller implements. A famous dividing line was drawn across the map, suggesting that populations east of it had followed a simpler technological path. The pattern was real in the limited collections then available, but the explanation often moved too quickly from difference to deficiency. Toolkits were treated as signs of mental rank, and the absence of familiar forms was interpreted as evidence that Eastern populations had failed to develop or preserve abilities seen elsewhere. Later discoveries have made that picture much harder to defend. Large cutting tools have been found in parts of China and elsewhere east of the old boundary, while other sites reveal prepared cores, organized flake production, varied raw material choices, and technologies that do not fit a single Eastern tradition. These discoveries do not mean that every region of Asia followed the same sequence as Africa or Europe. They show that the continent contains several technological histories, some overlapping and some strongly shaped by local conditions. A method common in one river basin might be rare in another, because suitable stone differed, because tasks differed, or because populations carried distinct traditions. The older comparison also depended heavily on what archaeologists had excavated and what landscapes preserved. Research was concentrated unevenly. Some regions contained exposed river terraces or caves that made ancient material easier to find, while tropical forests, floodplains, volcanic deposits, and submerged coastal shelves concealed or destroyed other sites. Collections gathered early in archaeological history were sometimes small, poorly dated, or removed from their original geological context. When those collections were used to describe an entire continent, the gaps in research could be mistaken for gaps in human behavior. Preservation introduced another distortion. Stone survives, but wood and plant fiber usually do not. A population relying heavily on bamboo, wooden points, digging tools, or containers could leave a stone assemblage that appears limited even if its complete technology was varied. Rare discoveries of preserved wooden implements in Asia remind us that the durable record may be only a narrow remainder of what people actually used. It would be equally mistaken, however, to replace the old story with a new claim that every ancient population possessed the same abilities or technologies. The evidence shows diversity, not uniformity. Some groups produced large-shaped tools, some emphasized flakes or small implements, and some combined several methods. Traditions could persist for long periods without implying stagnation, because a reliable technique may remain useful. New methods could also appear without proving the arrival of a new species. At the origin of the human story in Asia, technology followed regional paths created by environment, available material, population contact, and inherited knowledge. The continent was not waiting passively for innovation to arrive from somewhere else. Its human populations were making decisions within local worlds, and the uneven traces of those decisions cannot be arranged safely into a ladder of higher and lower minds. What once looked like technological absence increasingly appears as a mixture of genuine regional difference, missing organic tools, incomplete excavation, and scientific expectations that were themselves shaped by an incomplete map. Recent evidence from northern China has also documented prepared core methods earlier than older regional models expected, while exceptionally preserved wooden implements from southwestern China reveal activities that stone alone could not represent. Such finds do not erase uncertainty or prove direct cultural connections across distant regions. They demonstrate why conclusions about ancient ability must remain open when the surviving sample is small and one material dominates what can be recovered. During colder periods of the Pleistocene, so much water was held in continental ice that the seas around Southeast Asia fell far below their present shorelines. The shallow Sunda Shelf emerged as land, joining areas that now appear separate on a modern map. The Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and many smaller islands became parts of a much larger region commonly called Sundaland. Rivers crossed plains that are now beneath the sea, forests and open habitats occupied the exposed ground, and animals could move through territories that would later be divided by water. For early human populations already living in mainland Asia, this changing geography could turn the southern edge of the continent into an extended landscape rather than a chain of isolated islands. A group moving gradually through river valleys and suitable habitats did not need to cross the same seas that exist today in order to approach Java or other western islands. Yet Sundaland was never a single permanent bridge. Sea level rose and fell repeatedly, redrawing the land over long periods. A route that remained open for many generations could narrow, become wetter, or disappear. Large rivers altered course across the exposed shelf, while rainfall and vegetation changed with climate. Some reconstructions suggest broad areas of forest, while others indicate mixtures of woodland, grassland, and drier habitats. The exact pattern was not identical everywhere or at every time. Human movement would have depended on local water, food, terrain, and animal communities, not on exposed land alone. A map can show that ground existed, but it cannot prove that people crossed every part of it or remained there continuously. Each retreat and return of the sea changed not only distance, but also the possible relationships between separated human communities. The greatest difficulty is that much of this landscape is now submerged. Any camps beside former rivers, wetlands, or coasts may lie beneath sediments and seawater. Coastal environments could have provided shellfish, plants, fresh water, and roots along the edge of the land, yet their archaeological record is among the hardest to recover. What survives on present islands and mainland margins may therefore represent only the elevated edges of a much larger inhabited world. The empty sea between modern coastlines can create the false impression that ancient populations lived on separate islands when their landscapes were once connected. At the same time, lower seas did not remove every water barrier. Islands farther east, including Flores and Sulawesi, remained separated from Sundaland by deep channels. The Philippines also could not be reached simply by walking across the exposed Sunda Shelf. Even during major low sea levels, some crossings required movement over water, whether deliberate, accidental, or achieved through processes that the surviving evidence cannot reconstruct. It is therefore unsafe to imagine all of Southeast Asia as one continuous land route. The region contained both broad terrestrial connections and persistent marine boundaries. This difference becomes essential when asking who reached the east before Homo sapiens. Fossils associated with Homo erectus in Java can be understood within a landscape that was at times connected more closely to mainland Southeast Asia. Human traces on islands that never joined Sunderland raise a different and more difficult question. They suggest that some archaic populations reached places where geography alone cannot explain every step. Sunderland opened a southern pathway, but it did not erase the sea. It allowed people, animals, and environments to spread across a wider world, then divided that world again as water returned. The first human history of island Southeast Asia was therefore shaped by a coastline that repeatedly moved, preserving some populations on land while drowning many of the routes and settlements that might have revealed how they arrived. On the island of Luzon, in the northern Philippines, a river deposit at Kalinga preserves one of the most important signs that archaic humans reached islands beyond the exposed plains of Sunderland. The evidence does not include a human skull or skeleton. It consists of stone tools and the remains of animals, most notably a rhinoceros whose bones carry cut marks and impact damage interpreted as the result of butchery. The archaeological layer has been dated to roughly 700,000 years ago, placing human activity on Luzon long before Homo sapiens reached the region. This discovery changed the scale of the problem. Luzon was not connected to mainland Asia by an exposed land bridge. Even during major periods of low sea level, deep water remained between the island and the nearest continental land. Whoever left the tools at Kalinga had therefore reached a place that could not be entered simply by walking across the enlarged landscape of Sunderland. The site itself offers a quiet scene rather than a complete story. Stone flakes and cores were found with animal bones in ancient sediment laid down near a river. Marks on the rhinoceros skeleton indicate that sharp edges were used to remove tissue, while fractures on some bones suggest efforts to reach useful material inside. These observations support deliberate processing by a tool-making human population. They do not reveal how many individuals were present, how long they remained, or whether the event represented a permanent settlement. One occupation beside a river cannot describe the full history of Luzon, and the surviving objects may record only a brief moment within a much longer presence. Other visits could have occurred without leaving material that survived, while later floods may have removed additional evidence from nearby ground. The visible site is therefore not necessarily the beginning of occupation, only the oldest securely recognized moment currently preserved. The identity of the toolmakers is even less certain. Homo erectus lived elsewhere in Southeast Asia and is sometimes proposed as a possible source population, but no fossil at Kalinga connects the site directly to that species. Homo luzonensis is known from much later remains on the Sading Island, yet the enormous gap in time prevents a simple claim that the Kalinga toolmakers were members or direct ancestors of that population. The safest conclusion is that an unknown archaic human group reached Luzon and used stone tools there. A scientific name cannot be recovered from the marks on an animal bone. The water crossing creates another temptation to move beyond the evidence. It may seem natural to imagine carefully built boats, planned voyages, or organized exploration, but Kalinga preserves none of these things. People could have crossed deliberately using simple watercraft, or individuals may have been carried by storms, floods, floating vegetation, or a combination of circumstances repeated over generations. Small sea gaps may also have differed as coastlines shifted, although deep channels remained. Archaeology cannot yet choose confidently among these possibilities. What it can show is that the result was possible. A human population reached an oceanic island much earlier than older models once expected. Kalinga therefore widens the meaning of the first human movement into the east. The early inhabitants of Asia were not confined to continental corridors and exposed shelves. At least some reached landscapes separated by water, adapted long enough to obtain animals and workstone, and left evidence without leaving recognizable bodies. Their arrival on Luzon does not prove mastery of the sea, but it removes the sea as an absolute boundary. The island holds a human presence whose actions can be seen more clearly than its ancestry, and whose journey remains hidden behind the water it somehow crossed. The discovery of archaic humans on islands beyond the exposed Sunda Shelf creates a question that archaeology cannot yet answer with confidence. Stone tools and butchered animal bones can show that people reached an island, but they do not preserve the vessel, accident, current, or decision that carried them across the water. Deep channels remained between Sunderland and islands such as Flores, Sulawesi, and Luzon even when sea level was much lower than it is today. The distances and coastlines changed, but dry land did not connect every destination. Any human population reaching those islands had to cross water at least once, and successful occupation may have required more than the arrival of one isolated individual. This fact is important, but it does not allow us to describe the crossing as a planned voyage. No surviving boat has been found from these early periods, and perishable materials such as wood, bark, rope, or reeds would rarely endure across such immense spans of time. The absence of watercraft is therefore not proof that none existed, yet neither can possible boats be treated as established facts. Several paths remain open. A small group might have used simple floating devices deliberately, moving between visible coasts during calm conditions. People might also have been carried offshore by storms, floods, or drifting masses of vegetation. Accidental transport is known among animals, but human colonization presents a more difficult problem because a population must survive after arrival. Enough individuals or repeated arrivals over time would normally be needed to create a lasting community. Models can examine which possibilities are more or less likely, but they cannot recover the exact event. The sea crossing may have been planned, partly controlled, or produced by rare circumstances that left no direct trace. The ancient shoreline also looked different from the modern one. Lower sea levels could reduce some distances, expose stepping points, and alter currents, while volcanic islands may have been visible from neighbouring land under favourable conditions. Visibility, however, is not the same as safe passage. A coast seen across water can still be difficult to reach, especially without evidence for sails, navigation, or durable craft. The people involved did not need to understand the full geography of the region. They may have moved from one island to another across generations, with each crossing extending a population slightly farther into the eastern seas. One successful arrival could be followed by isolation lasting thousands of years. Repeated occupation at more than one island suggests that water crossings were not confined to a single exceptional place, although the evidence still cannot reveal whether the same method was used each time. Such isolation would affect more than movement. A small island population could lose contact with its source, experience limited genetic diversity, and adapt to resources unlike those of the mainland. Later generations might become physically distinct while preserving stoneworking traditions inherited from earlier ancestors. In this way, water could act both as a route and as an evolutionary boundary. It allowed a rare passage, then prevented frequent return. The first humans who entered island Southeast Asia before Homo sapiens therefore reveal an ability without explaining its method. They demonstrate that deep water was not an absolute wall, but they do not show whether crossing it required technology, chance, persistence, or several of these together. The most honest picture is not of fearless ancient sailors, nor of helpless castaways carried blindly into the unknown. It is of human populations reaching places that geography made difficult, leaving enough evidence to prove the result while losing nearly every trace of the journey itself. At the eastern edge of the early human world, the sea-preserved islands separated populations and kept the manner of their arrival hidden. On the island of Flores, the human story took a form that would have been difficult to predict from the mainland. In Liang Bua, a limestone cave in western Flores, researchers recovered the remains of a small-bodied human population later named Homo floresiensis. The best-known individual had a very small body and a brain far smaller than that of Homo sapiens. Yet the surrounding archaeological record showed that these humans made and used stone tools. Their anatomy was not simply a smaller version of ours. The skull, teeth, limbs, feet, and other parts of the skeleton combined features that researchers have compared with several earlier members of the human family. This unusual mixture created debate about where Homo floresiensis belonged, but the fossils are widely accepted as representing a distinct extinct human species rather than a modern human affected by ordinary variation. Flores itself is central to understanding why such a body could exist. The island remained separated from Sunderland by deep water, so the ancestors of Homo floresiensis had to reach it through at least one water crossing. Once there, a population could remain isolated from larger mainland groups for many generations. Islands often alter the evolutionary pressures acting on animals. Large species may become smaller when food is limited, predators are few, and a reduced body requires less energy to maintain. Small species can sometimes become larger under a different balance of resources and competition. These patterns are not automatic rules, and human evolution cannot be reconstructed from analogy alone. But Flores contained other examples of unusual island body size, including small forms of stegodon. The environment therefore provides a plausible setting in which a human population could become smaller over time. Evidence from Mata Menge in the Soa Basin of central Flores has pushed this history much deeper than the occupation known at Liangbua. Teeth, jaw fragments, and a small adult arm bone from much older deposits show that very small hominins were already living on Flores hundreds of thousands of years before the later Liangbua individuals. The arm bone is especially important because its size indicates that the individual was extremely small, perhaps even smaller than the best-known Homo floresiensis skeleton. These remains suggest that reduced body size appeared early in the Flores lineage rather than developing only near the end of its history. Some dental features also resemble early Asian Homo erectus, supporting the possibility that the Flores population descended from Homo erectus ancestors that reached the island and then changed under long isolation. This remains the leading explanation, but the evidence is not complete enough to remove every alternative. No ancient DNA has yet provided a direct genetic relationship, and the fossil record between the earliest arrival and the known Mata Menge remains is sparse. The island may have preserved only scattered moments from a much longer sequence of change. It is also unsafe to imagine that smaller bodies meant weaker minds, failed adaptation, or a population moving toward extinction. Homo floresiensis survived on Flores across a very long period and continued making effective stone tools within an island environment. Body size records one aspect of adaptation, not a ranking of human value or ability. The deeper lesson is that the first humans in Asia did not all respond to new landscapes in the same way. On Flores, water cut a population off from the mainland, limited contact with other humans, and created conditions in which a distinct body could emerge. The island did not preserve an unchanged visitor. It preserved a branch of humanity transformed by remaining in one small part of the East for generations beyond counting. On Luzon, another small collection of fossils reveals how little material may be needed to change the human map and how much uncertainty can remain after that change. In Kalau Cave, archaeologists recovered teeth, hand and foot bones, and part of a thigh bone belonging to at least several individuals. The remains were assigned to a distinct species called Homo luzonensis. They came from deposits more than 50,000 years old, placing this population on Luzon before Homo sapiens became the only human presence in the region. The fossils are few, however, and no skull has been found. There is no complete face, no pelvis, and no skeleton from which overall body shape can be reconstructed with confidence. Almost everything known about Homo luzonensis begins with small fragments, especially teeth and bones from the fingers and toes. The teeth are unusual because they combine features that do not fit neatly within one familiar human group. Some are small and relatively simple in ways that resemble later members of Homo, while others retain traits that researchers compare with much earlier hominins. The curved shapes and joint surfaces of some hand and foot bones have also been described as more similar to older human relatives than to Homo sapiens. These comparisons do not mean that Homo luzonensis was a living survivor of an ancient African form, nor do they prove that its members moved through trees in a particular way. A bone can suggest how joints were shaped, but it cannot restore an entire pattern of movement from a few individuals. The fossils are important precisely because they resist a simple arrangement from primitive to modern. Their anatomy appears to preserve a mixture created by a history that is no longer visible. Island isolation may have contributed to that history. Luzon remained separated from the Asian mainland by water even during periods of lower sea level. Once an ancestral population reached the island, limited contact with other humans could allow distinctive features to persist or develop over many generations. Yet the identity of those ancestors remains unknown. The much older archaeological evidence from Kalinga shows that archaic humans were already present on Luzon hundreds of thousands of years earlier, but the long interval between Kalinga and Kalau prevents a confident claim of direct descent. The toolmakers at Kalinga could have belonged to an ancestral population, to a different group that later vanished, or to one of several arrivals whose relationships cannot yet be recovered. No fossil bridge connects the two records. Ancient DNA has not been recovered from the Kalau remains, and the warm, humid environment of the Philippines makes genetic preservation difficult. Without DNA, researchers must rely mainly on anatomy, geological context, and comparisons with other fossils. This is enough to recognize a distinctive human form, but not enough to settle its exact position within the wider human family. Even estimated body size remains uncertain because the surviving bones do not include the parts usually used for a reliable rank structure. It also warns against treating an island as an evolutionary museum where one ancient type simply remained unchanged. Isolation can preserve some features while altering others, and later arrivals may replace or mix with earlier populations. The surviving anatomy records this complex history only indirectly, through differences whose causes remain uncertain even today. Homo luzonensis should therefore not be reduced to a dramatic image of a tiny, mysterious island human. The evidence supports a separate population with a distinctive combination of traits, while leaving its appearance, ancestry, behavior, and relationship to earlier island inhabitants only partly known. At the eastern edge of Asia, Luzon preserved not a complete people, but a few hard fragments from a branch that lived beside others in the late Pleistocene world. Those fragments show that human diversity on the islands was greater than the survival of Homo sapiens alone would ever have allowed us to imagine. The islands of Southeast Asia remind us that evolution is rarely a straight path, leading toward a single destination. Isolation does not simply preserve ancient populations unchanged, nor does it always push them toward one predictable outcome. Instead, it allows different combinations of inherited traits, local environments, and chance events to shape each population in its own way. Flores and Luzon illustrate this principle with unusual clarity. Both islands preserve evidence for human groups that differed from Homo sapiens, and from one another, yet neither island tells exactly the same story. Homo floresiensis is known from more complete remains that reveal a remarkably small body combined with a distinctive mixture of anatomical features. Homo luzonensis is represented by far fewer fossils, leaving much of its appearance uncertain. Together, they show that the eastern edge of Asia was occupied by more than one human lineage during the later part of the Pleistocene, and that long periods of isolation could produce outcomes impossible to predict from mainland fossils alone. These discoveries also change the way we think about human diversity. For many years, it was tempting to picture the human family as a sequence in which one species replaced another across the entire Old World. The islands argue against such simplicity. At different times, mainland Asia contained populations commonly assigned to Homo erectus, while other regions were occupied by Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, and the island groups now known from Flores and Luzon. These populations did not necessarily meet one another, and they certainly did not all share the same history. Some may have survived for very long periods in relative isolation, while others disappeared before neighbouring populations ever arrived. The result was not one human landscape, but many overlapping landscapes, each following its own evolutionary course. This diversity should not be mistaken for a collection of strange exceptions. Small fossil samples naturally attract attention because they appear unusual, but rarity in the archaeological record does not mean rarity in the ancient world. Entire populations may have existed without leaving more than a handful of recoverable bones. Warm climates, acidic soils, volcanic activity, erosion, rising seas, and dense vegetation all reduce the chances that skeletons would survive. The fossils we possess today may represent only a tiny fraction of the human communities that once lived across island Southeast Asia. Many lineages could have disappeared without leaving any recognizable trace at all. Even among the populations that are known, uncertainty remains an essential part of the evidence. We still cannot say precisely when the ancestors of Homo floresiensis first reached Flores, how many times humans entered Luzon before Homo sapiens, or whether undiscovered island populations once lived between these regions. New excavations continue to reshape the picture, sometimes with only a tooth, a finger bone, or a fragment of jaw. Each discovery adds another piece to the map without completing it. The Eastern Islands, therefore, teach a broader lesson about the beginning of humanity in Asia. Evolution did not produce one successful human form that simply spread across every landscape in the same way. Geography divided populations, limited contact, and allowed separate histories to unfold over immense spans of time. Some branches became smaller, others retained older anatomical traits, and some left descendants whose relationships remain uncertain. By the time Homo sapiens eventually expanded through this region, the islands were not empty places waiting for new arrivals. They had already been part of a much older human world, one whose diversity is only beginning to emerge from scattered bones, stone tools, and landscapes that still conceal far more than they reveal. For more than a century, the search for ancient humans depended almost entirely on what could be seen with the eye. Researchers compared the shapes of skulls, jaws, teeth, and limb bones, looking for patterns that might reveal relationships between populations separated by thousands of kilometers and immense spans of time. This approach transformed our understanding of human evolution, but it also had clear limits. A fragment of bone could resemble more than one known group. Some fossils were too incomplete to classify confidently, while others combined anatomical features that did not fit comfortably within existing categories. Then, early in the 21st century, an unexpected kind of evidence entered the story. Instead of beginning with the visible shape of a fossil, researchers began examining tiny fragments of ancient genetic material that had survived inside it. This new approach did not replace anatomy, but it added another layer of evidence that sometimes revealed relationships invisible to the eye. One of the most remarkable examples came from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. The cave had already produced archaeological evidence showing repeated occupation over long periods, including stone tools, animal remains, and fossils from different human populations. Among the discoveries was a small finger bone that appeared unremarkable when viewed by itself. It was far too incomplete to reveal the appearance of the person who had carried it. No complete skull, face, or skeleton accompanied it. Under earlier methods, such a fragment might have remained little more than an isolated fossil with uncertain significance. Instead, researchers succeeded in recovering ancient DNA from the bone. The genetic evidence revealed that it belonged neither to a Neanderthal nor to Homo sapiens. It represented a previously unknown branch of the human family that later became known as the Denisovans. This discovery changed the meaning of the archaeological record. A population that had remained almost completely invisible in anatomical terms suddenly became visible through genetics. The remarkable aspect of the discovery was not that DNA replaced fossils, but that it showed how incomplete the fossil record alone could be. Entire human populations might exist with almost no recognizable skeletal evidence if suitable genetic material happened to survive. Denisovans remind us that extinction does not always erase every trace. Their bones remain extremely rare, yet their genetic legacy survives in some living human populations today. Even so, DNA has its own limits. Ancient genetic material survives only under favorable conditions, usually in cool, stable environments. Warm and humid climates rapidly break DNA into fragments too damaged for analysis. Much of tropical Asia, therefore, preserves almost no recoverable ancient DNA, even when fossils survive. This means that the absence of genetic evidence cannot be treated as proof that a population never existed. It often reflects the climate rather than the history of the people themselves. Denisova Cave was unusually fortunate because its environmental conditions allowed genetic material to endure for tens of thousands of years. The cave itself also records repeated occupations by different human groups rather than one uninterrupted population. Archaeological layers show that Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans all used the cave during different periods. And one remarkable fossil even belonged to an individual whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. These discoveries reveal that the human world of Eurasia was more interconnected than once imagined. Separate populations sometimes met, shared genes, and continued their histories in ways that neither fossils nor stone tools alone could have revealed. At the eastern edge of this story, Denisovans remind us that Asia still contains chapters hidden beyond ordinary sight. A tiny fragment of bone, once thought too small to answer meaningful questions, revealed an entire branch of humanity that had remained unknown for thousands of years. Sometimes the greatest discoveries do not come from finding a larger fossil. They come from learning to read information that had always been present, quietly preserved inside the smallest surviving pieces of the ancient human past. The discovery of Denisovans in Siberia raised an immediate question. Were they a small northern population confined to the Altai Mountains, or part of a much wider human presence across Asia? An answer began to emerge from Baishia Karst Cave on the northeastern Tibetan Plateau. Long before genetic evidence was recovered from the cave sediments, a partial lower jaw had been found there. The specimen, known as the Xiahe mandible, was robust, lacked a chin, and preserved large molars. Its shape was unusual, but anatomy alone could not identify it securely. No ancient DNA survived in the fossil, which was not surprising in a region where preservation conditions differed from the cold stability of Denisova Cave. Instead, researchers turned to ancient proteins preserved in the tooth enamel and dentine. Proteins carry biological information because their amino acid sequences are ultimately encoded by genes. They do not preserve ancestry as fully as DNA, but they can survive longer and under conditions where DNA is already broken down. The protein evidence linked the Xiahe jaw to the Denisovan population known genetically from Siberia. This made the mandible the first widely accepted Denisovan fossil identified outside Denisova Cave, and gave the group a much larger geographical presence than the few Siberian remains had suggested. The jaw was also very old, dating to at least around 160,000 years ago, which placed Denisovan-related humans on the Tibetan Plateau long before Homo sapiens became established there. The plateau was not a mild environment. Baishia lies at high elevation, where thin air, low temperatures, strong winds, and seasonal scarcity create serious demands on the body. The fossil does not reveal exactly how the people living there managed those pressures. It cannot tell us what clothing they wore, how often they used fire, whether they stayed throughout the year, or how widely they moved across the plateau. Yet their presence shows that archaic humans were capable of occupying high-altitude environments much earlier than older models once assumed. Later research strengthened this picture. Ancient mitochondrial DNA recovered directly from cave sediments showed repeated Denisovan presence during widely separated periods. More recent proteomic work identified an additional human rib fragment from a younger layer and linked it to Denisovans, suggesting that people related to this population used the cave across a very long span rather than during one isolated visit. Animal bones from the site also indicate that hominins processed a wide range of local fauna, though the precise organization of their daily life remains unknown. These finds do not prove that Denisovans occupied the entire plateau continuously. They show repeated human presence at one important cave and support the idea that high-altitude Asia formed part of their wider range. Baishia therefore transforms Denisovans from a name attached to a Siberian cave into a population with a broader Asian history. It also shows why human identity cannot always be recovered through one kind of evidence. The jaw provided anatomy, proteins provided biological connection, sediments preserved genetic traces, and surrounding animal remains revealed repeated activity. None of these records was complete alone. Together they showed that Denisovan-related humans occupied both the Altai region and the Tibetan Plateau, environments separated by great distance and very different conditions. The first humans in Asia were not only moving across lowland corridors. Some branches reached high ground, endured demanding climates, and remained there long enough to leave a layered record. The East was already divided among human populations whose full range could remain hidden until science learned to read molecules surviving inside bone, teeth, and even the soil beneath an ancient cave floor. Denisovans disappeared as a distinct human population, but their disappearance was not complete. When Homo sapiens entered Asia, some members of our species met Denisovan populations and had children with them. Over many generations, most Denisovan communities vanished, yet fragments of their DNA remained inside the descendants of those encounters. Those fragments are still present in living people today, especially among populations whose ancestors lived in parts of Southeast Asia, New Guinea, and Oceania. While smaller amounts appear in several Asian populations, the pattern is not identical everywhere. Different groups carry different Denisovan-related segments, suggesting that contact may have occurred more than once and perhaps with Denisovan populations that were themselves genetically distinct. This makes Denisovans more difficult to picture as one small, uniform people centered on a single Siberian cave. Their genetic traces point instead toward a broad and divided presence somewhere across ancient Asia, even though fossils have been identified at only a few locations. Living DNA, therefore, becomes a map of encounters whose exact places are mostly unknown. It can show that mixing occurred, estimate broad relationships, and reveal that archaic ancestry entered Homo sapiens populations. It cannot restore the individual meetings behind that ancestry. We do not know what language, gestures, fears, or expectations were present when different humans encountered one another. Genetics proves biological contact, but it does not tell us whether contact was brief or repeated, peaceful or violent, or understood by those involved as a meeting between different kinds of people. Such details disappeared with the individuals themselves. Some inherited Denisovan variants later became useful in particular environments. One well-known example involves the epas, one region carried at high frequency among many Tibetan populations. This genetic inheritance is associated with the body's response to low oxygen at high altitude and is closely related to Denisovan DNA. The connection offers a striking possibility grounded in genetics. A variant inherited from an extinct human population contributed to the later survival of Homo sapiens in a demanding environment. Yet this should not be simplified into the claim that Denisovans deliberately gave modern humans an adaptation, or that one gene alone explains life on the plateau. Natural selection acts after inheritance, increasing the frequency of variants that improve reproductive success under local conditions. High-altitude adaptation also involves multiple biological and cultural factors. The Denisovan contribution became important because later human populations carried it into a setting where it offered an advantage. Most archaic DNA did not follow this path. Some inherited fragments were lost through chance, while others may have been reduced because they carried disadvantages in Homo sapiens genomes. What survives today is a filtered remainder, shaped by population movement, selection, and thousands of generations of reproduction. A living person with Denisovan ancestry is not partly Denisovan in any simple social or species sense. The fragments are small portions of a genome inherited through distant ancestors, mixed within the far larger history of Homo sapiens. Still, their existence changes the meaning of extinction. Denisovans no longer survive as a separate population with their own continuous communities, but parts of their biological history remain active within ours. The first humans in Asia were therefore not always replaced without leaving descendants. Some were absorbed into later populations, carrying ancient Asian histories forward inside bodies that belong to a different human branch. The bones at Denisova and Baishia show where Denisovans once lived, while modern genomes reveal that their contacts extended far beyond the few caves that preserved them. Their world disappeared, but it did not vanish without entering ours. By the middle part of the Pleistocene, the human fossil record of Eastern Asia becomes harder to arrange into a simple sequence. Earlier remains commonly grouped under Homo erectus are joined by skulls, jaws, and teeth that preserve unfamiliar combinations of features. Some look more derived in parts of the face or brain case, while retaining other traits that seem older. Others resemble fossils associated with different populations without matching any one group closely enough to make classification easy. These remains do not form a clear ladder leading from Homo erectus directly to Homo sapiens. They suggest a continent in which several human populations may have survived, separated, met, or changed at overlapping times. Hualongdong, in eastern China, offers one of the clearest examples. Fossils from the site include part of a skull, teeth, a jaw, and additional skeletal remains belonging to several individuals. The deposits are roughly 300,000 years old, placing them in a period when human diversity across Eurasia was already complex. The best preserved young individual has a face with some features that appear closer to later humans than those usually seen in classic Homo erectus, yet the skull and teeth also retain more archaic characteristics. This mixture has made Hualongdong important, but it has not turned the fossils into a settled new species. Researchers continue to debate whether they represent a regional population related to Homo sapiens, a branch connected more closely to other Asian archaic humans, or part of a wider pattern of variation that current names describe only imperfectly. The word mosaic is often used for fossils like these because different parts of the body seem to point in different evolutionary directions. That description is useful, but it should not create the illusion that evolution assembled traits randomly. Features can persist at different rates. A population may retain an older form in one part of the skeleton while other features change. Contact and interbreeding between separated groups can also create combinations that do not resemble a simple ancestor and descendant sequence. Ordinary variation within a population adds another difficulty, especially when the fossil sample contains only a few individuals. A young person may not display the same fully developed anatomy as an adult, and damage can alter the shape researchers must reconstruct. Hualongdong is not alone. Fossils from Dali, Jinyushan, Shujiayao, Shuchang, Harbin, and other East Asian sites have also been placed in different relationships depending on which anatomical features and comparisons are emphasized. Some have been linked cautiously with Denisovans, others with early Homo sapiens, and others with proposed species whose acceptance remains debated. New protein evidence from the Harbin skull has strengthened a Denisovan connection for that particular fossil, but it does not automatically identify every similar-looking skull in East Asia as Denisovan. Anatomical resemblance can suggest a relationship. It cannot replace direct molecular evidence where that evidence is absent. The first humans in Asia had already produced long regional histories by this time. Populations could remain separated in northern valleys, central plains, highlands, and southern forests, then expand when climate reopened roots. Their fossils may preserve the consequences of those movements without preserving enough information to name every branch. The difficulty of classification is therefore not merely a problem caused by careless science. It may reflect the ancient reality itself. Human populations were not arranged in clean boxes, and their boundaries could become blurred through ancestry, isolation, and renewed contact. Hualongdong shows us a face from that complicated world, but not a final label. Its importance lies in resisting the old expectation that every Asian fossil must fit neatly between Homo erectus and ourselves. Scientific names are necessary because they allow researchers to compare fossils, describe recurring anatomical patterns, and discuss possible relationships across time and space. Yet, every name also draws a boundary, and the ancient human populations of East Asia may not have lived within boundaries as clean as those used in modern classification. A skull can be assigned to Homo erectus because it shares a broad set of features with other fossils, while still differing enough to suggest regional development. Another specimen may resemble early Homo sapiens in the face but retain a more archaic brain case. Teeth may point toward one relationship, while the jaw or brow region suggests another. When such combinations appear, researchers must decide whether they reflect variation within a known population, contact between populations, gradual change, or a lineage not yet clearly represented elsewhere. The decision is rarely made from one feature alone, and it may remain uncertain when the fossil is incomplete. This is why several East Asian fossils have received changing interpretations as new comparisons and methods became available. A specimen once placed broadly among archaic humans may later be discussed as a possible relative of Denisovans, an early member of the lineage leading toward Homo sapiens, or a distinct regional population. These revisions do not mean that science has failed. They show that classification is a working model built from limited evidence, rather than a final label hidden inside the bone. The problem becomes sharper when a new species name is proposed. Naming a species can draw attention to a distinctive fossil and help organize research, but it can also create an impression of certainty stronger than the evidence supports. A species known from one skull, a few teeth, or a fragmentary jaw may later turn out to overlap with the normal variation of another group. The opposite danger also exists. Placing too many fossils inside one broad species can erase genuine diversity and make separate populations appear more uniform than they were. East Asia contains both risks because fossils are scattered across large distances and often separated by long intervals. The people represented by them may have lived in populations that occasionally exchanged genes, then became isolated again, as climate and geography altered roots. Their anatomical boundaries could therefore have been porous. A label that works for one region or period may become less useful when applied across the whole continent. Molecular evidence can sometimes clarify these relationships, but it is not available for most fossils. DNA rarely survives in warm or humid settings, and protein evidence is still limited to particular tissues and preservation conditions. Even when a molecular link is found, it may answer only part of the question. Connecting one skull with Denisovans does not mean that every similar skull belongs to the same population, just as a difference in shape does not prove a separate species. Anatomy, archaeology, geography, and molecules must be considered together. The first humans in Asia were living populations, not rows of museum categories. They could vary within communities, mix with neighbouring groups, and change gradually across generations. Scientific names remain essential, but they should function as careful tools rather than fixed portraits. The fossils that refuse a simple name may be preserving exactly what a branching and interconnected human history should look like. Not orderly boxes, but overlapping populations whose edges became visible only after their worlds had disappeared. This uncertainty protects the central question from an easy but misleading answer. The earliest Eastern populations cannot be counted simply by counting names, because several names may describe related forms, while one broad name may conceal multiple histories. What matters is the evidence supporting each boundary and the willingness to revise it when another fossil changes the pattern. A fossil can be unusual without proving that it belongs to a newly discovered human species. This distinction is easy to lose because a new name offers a sense of order. It turns an incomplete skull or jaw into a recognizable figure and gives researchers a stable term for comparison. Yet naming is an interpretation, not an event preserved inside the bone. The Harbin cranium from northeastern China shows why caution matters. Its large brain case, broad face, heavy brow region, and other features differed from both classic Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. In 2021, researchers proposed that it represented a new species, Homo longi. Other specialists questioned whether the skull might instead belong to the Denisovan population, which was known genetically but lacked a clearly identified complete cranium. Both possibilities attempted to organize real evidence, but anatomy alone could not settle the relationship. The debate changed when ancient proteins and mitochondrial DNA recovered from material associated with the skull linked the Harbin individual to Denisovans. This molecular identification did not make the earlier anatomical work useless. It showed that a fossil proposed as a new species could also represent the visible face of a population first discovered through genetics. It also raised a difficult question about names. If Harbin is Denisovan, should Homo longi become a formal species name for Denisovans, or should it remain a proposed category until more fossils connect anatomy, proteins, and genomes? Researchers do not all answer this in the same way. The disagreement reflects different definitions of species and different judgments about how much evidence is needed to draw a boundary. A similar lesson comes from the Penghu jaw found near Taiwan. Its thick bone and very large molars had long suggested an archaic human, unlike Homo sapiens, but its identity remained uncertain. Ancient protein analysis later connected it with Denisovans. Two fossils from widely separated parts of Eastern Asia could therefore be assigned to the same broad population through molecules, even though their complete bodies and local histories remain unknown. This does not mean that every robust jaw or heavy-browed skull in Asia should now be called Denisovan. Resemblance is not direct identification. Several populations may share inherited features, and related groups can differ after long isolation. A molecular result from one specimen cannot be transferred automatically to fossils that merely look similar. The opposite mistake would be to create a new mysterious species whenever a fossil fails to match familiar examples. Fragmentary remains exaggerate uncertainty because missing anatomy prevents full comparison. Distortion during burial can change shape, while age, sex, and ordinary individual variation can make one person appear unlike another. Small samples also hide the range of variation that once existed within a population. The ancient East may truly have contained human branches that remain unnamed, but uncertainty is not evidence for any particular hidden species. A responsible account must separate three claims. A fossil is distinctive, a fossil belongs to a separate population, and that population deserves recognition as a separate species. Each claim requires stronger support than the one before it. The first humans in Asia cannot be recovered simply by multiplying labels. New names may reveal diversity, but they may also divide related people too sharply or disguise the fact that later evidence can reconnect them. Harbin and Penghu show how bones, proteins, and DNA can correct one another without producing a final map. Future discoveries may unite fossils now given different names, or separate remains currently placed together. The human past in Eastern Asia was genuinely complex, yet its complexity should be measured by evidence rather than by the number of mysteries we create. When Homo sapiens began moving farther into Asia, our species was not entering a continent without human history. Other populations had already occupied its valleys, plateaus, forests, grasslands, caves, and islands for immense spans of time. Some belonged to lineages commonly grouped with Homo erectus. Others were related to Neanderthals or Denisovans, while still others are known only from fragmentary fossils whose relationships remain uncertain. The arrival of our species, therefore, did not mark the beginning of humanity in the East. It introduced another human population into a landscape where several branches had already adapted to local conditions, become separated, and sometimes met one another again. The movement of Homo sapiens out of Africa was also not one simple event that carried a single population across Asia without interruption. Fossils, archaeology, and genetics indicate repeated expansions into southwestern Asia, some of which may have ended without leaving substantial ancestry in later populations. Periods of greater rainfall could open routes across regions that were otherwise dry, while later aridity might isolate or remove the groups that had entered. The major expansion that contributed most strongly to living populations appears to have occurred later, but even that movement divided into routes and populations whose histories were not identical. Some people travelled through interior corridors, others may have followed southern environments, river systems, or coastal regions. Their movements unfolded over generations rather than as a planned migration toward a known destination. Early Homo sapiens fossils reported from Southeast Asia suggest that members of our species reached far eastern regions earlier than older models once allowed, although the dating and interpretation of some early Asian remains continue to be debated. The safest picture is therefore not a single arrival date for the entire continent, but a sequence of movements that reached different regions at different times. Some expansions may have left little lasting genetic contribution, while later populations became ancestors of many people living in Asia today. Wherever Homo sapiens arrived, the human landscape could already be occupied. In Western Eurasia, our species encountered Neanderthals. Farther east, genetic evidence shows contact with Denisovan populations, though most of the locations and circumstances remain unknown. On islands, other groups such as Homo floresiensis or Homo luzonensis may still have survived during parts of the period when Homo sapiens was spreading through Southeast Asia, but direct meetings have not been demonstrated. Overlapping dates create the possibility of contact. They do not preserve the event itself. Archaeology rarely shows whether two populations shared one valley, avoided one another, arrived in different seasons, or lived centuries apart within the same broad interval. The transition was therefore unlikely to have been an immediate replacement in which one species appeared and every other human vanished. Populations could coexist regionally, exchange genes, compete for resources, retreat into smaller territories, or disappear before newcomers reached them. Some archaic groups entered the ancestry of Homo sapiens through interbreeding. Others may have vanished without leaving a detectable genetic contribution. Our species also arrived with no guaranteed outcome. Small migrating populations could fail, become isolated, or be absorbed into groups already present. The later success of Homo sapiens should not be projected backward as though every early movement was destined to spread. At the point when our species entered the occupied East, Asia held not an old world, simply giving way to a new one, but a shifting human landscape in which newcomers and established populations became part of the same unfinished history. When Homo sapiens entered regions already occupied by other human populations, contact did not have one universal form. Some groups may have lived far apart, separated by mountains, deserts, forests, or different seasonal ranges. Others may have used the same valley at different times without ever meeting. In places where populations did overlap, they could compete for water, animals, shelter, and useful stone, yet competition does not require constant violence. One group might withdraw when another became more numerous. They might use different parts of the same landscape or return during different seasons. Archaeology rarely preserves these relationships directly. A cave containing tools from more than one population may record visits separated by generations, while similar dates can still hide large gaps. The ground can show that different humans occupied a region, but not whether they watched one another across a river, shared a shelter, or remained unaware of the other group's presence. Genetics provides clearer evidence for one form of contact. Most people with ancestry outside Africa carry DNA inherited from Neanderthals, demonstrating that early Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthal populations after leaving Africa. Denisovan ancestry in several Asian and Oceanian populations shows that our species also had children with Denisovan-related humans. These were not merely neighbouring populations that remained biologically separate. At least some individuals met closely enough for their descendants to carry ancestry from both branches. The different patterns of Denisovan-related DNA among living populations suggest that contact may have occurred more than once, and with Denisovan groups that were not all genetically identical. This fits the wider Asian record, where Denisovan evidence appears from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau and farther south, across environments too varied to represent one small, permanently isolated community. Genetic contact does not reveal the social meaning of those encounters. It cannot tell us whether relationships were accepted, temporary, forced, or part of repeated interaction between neighbouring groups. It cannot recover the words people used, whether they considered one another familiar or strange, or how children of mixed ancestry were treated. These questions concern real human lives, but the available evidence does not answer them. The responsible conclusion is narrower. Interbreeding happened, some descendants survived, and fragments of archaic ancestry entered later Homo sapiens populations. Other forms of contact remain possible without being directly demonstrated. Knowledge could have moved between groups through observation or interaction, but similarities in tools do not prove such exchange. Populations could independently create comparable solutions to the same problems. Competition may have affected survival, yet the decline of archaic humans cannot be reduced to one superior species defeating another everywhere. Local numbers, birth rates, mobility, access to resources, climate shifts, disease, and repeated absorption into larger Homo sapiens populations could all matter. Their effects would differ from one region to another. A small group might disappear without conflict, simply because deaths repeatedly exceeded births. Another might persist biologically through descendants, while losing its separate identity. This brings the story back to the beginning of Homo sapiens in Asia. Our species did not merely pass across an occupied continent while remaining untouched by it. Encounters with earlier humans became part of our own population history. Some archaic groups left fossils and no known descendants. Others left genetic fragments but few recognizable bones. The arrival of Homo sapiens therefore blurred rather than instantly erased the old human boundaries. Across parts of Asia, replacement, coexistence, separation, and interbreeding were not competing explanations for one single event. They were different outcomes that could occur in different places, leaving a human landscape in which extinction and survival were sometimes carried inside the same descendants. The disappearance of archaic human populations across Asia cannot be explained by one cause acting everywhere in the same way. Climate changed repeatedly, altering forests, grasslands, rivers, coastlines, and the animals available for food. A population well adapted to one environment could become vulnerable when rainfall shifted, winters intensified, or familiar resources moved beyond reach. Yet climate alone does not explain why one human group vanished while another survived in the same broad region. Population size also mattered. Many archaic groups may have lived in small, scattered communities separated by great distances. Small populations are more easily affected by accidents, disease, poor harvests, low birth rates, and the loss of even a few adults. They also carry less genetic diversity, which can reduce resilience over many generations. A community does not need to suffer one dramatic catastrophe to disappear. If deaths remain slightly higher than births, or if neighbouring groups are too distant to replace lost members, decline can continue quietly until no separate population remains. The expansion of Homo sapiens added another pressure, but it should not be described as one simple conquest. Our species may often have arrived in larger or more connected populations, with wider social networks that helped move information, materials, and people across landscapes. Greater numbers alone could affect access to water, caves, hunting grounds, and useful stone. Competition might therefore occur without direct conflict. If Homo sapiens returned more frequently to the same valleys or recovered more quickly after local losses, smaller archaic populations could be pushed toward less favorable areas. In other places, newcomers and established groups may have occupied different habitats or passed through at different times, reducing direct competition. The balance would vary from one region to another. Interbreeding adds a more complicated form of disappearance. Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in living humans proves that some archaic populations had children with Homo sapiens and contributed to later generations. A small population can lose its separate identity through repeated mixing, even when many of its descendants survive. From this perspective, extinction does not always mean that every individual died without offspring. It can mean that the population ceased to exist as a distinct community because its members and descendants became absorbed into a larger group. Genetic survival and population disappearance can therefore happen together. Other archaic humans, including the island populations of Flores and Luzon, have not yet been shown to have contributed ancestry to living people. Their decline may have involved isolation, environmental change, competition, demographic weakness, or circumstances for which no evidence remains. The fossil record is too incomplete to assign the same ending to every branch. Even the timing of disappearance is often uncertain because the youngest known fossil marks only the latest individual currently discovered, not necessarily the final survivor. The arrival of Homo sapiens in the occupied East did not trigger one synchronized ending across Asia. It entered a continent where different populations already faced different risks. Some may have disappeared before meeting us. Some lived beside our species for a time. Some entered our ancestry, while others left only bones, tools, or uncertain traces in the ground. The old human world faded through many local histories rather than one final event, and the survival of Homo sapiens was not the inevitable conclusion it appears to be when viewed from the present. The first human history of Asia survives in several archives, and none of them is complete. Stone tools can outlast bodies, but they rarely reveal who made them. Fossils can preserve anatomy, yet a skull, tooth, or jaw may represent only one individual from a population whose full range of variation has disappeared. Ancient DNA can expose relationships that bones alone cannot show, but it survives unevenly and is especially difficult to recover from warm, humid regions. Proteins may endure longer and sometimes connect isolated fossils with known populations, though they carry less information than a complete genome. Geological layers can establish when an object or body was buried, but erosion, water, animals, and later disturbance may move evidence away from its original setting. The search for the first humans in the East, therefore, depends on several imperfect records that must support one another without being forced into agreement. A stone assemblage without fossils can establish presence but not species. A fossil without tools can reveal a body, but not every behavior. DNA without a complete skeleton can identify ancestry while leaving the person's face unknown. A submerged landscape may once have contained settlements, river crossings, and coastal routes, yet preserve no accessible evidence at all. These gaps do not mean that any imagined story is possible. They mean that confidence must be proportional to what survives. Archaeology becomes most reliable when different forms of evidence converge. Artifacts remain within secure sediments, dating methods agree, anatomical comparisons are supported by molecules, and the wider environment makes the proposed occupation plausible. Even then, the conclusion usually concerns a population, a relationship, or an interval of presence rather than the details of individual lives. Across Asia, this combined record reveals a history deeper and more crowded than the survival of Homo sapiens once suggested. Early toolmakers reached far into the continent before fossils clearly identify them. Populations grouped broadly as Homo erectus established long histories in China and Java. Unknown archaic humans crossed water to islands that had never joined the mainland. Flores and Luzon later preserved distinct human forms shaped within isolation. Denisovan-related populations occupied environments ranging from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau and left ancestry in some modern humans. Other East Asian fossils preserve mixtures of traits that still resist secure classification. These findings do not form a complete list of everyone who lived in ancient Asia. They are the branches that chance, geology, excavation, and scientific methods have made visible. The missing record may have been even more diverse. Coastal communities could lie beneath rising seas. Tropical populations may have lost their DNA to heat and moisture. Small groups could disappear without leaving a fossil that has yet been recognized. A toolmaker known from one valley may belong to a population whose bones remain undiscovered hundreds of kilometers away. The oldest known site is only the oldest site currently found and convincingly dated, not necessarily the true beginning of human presence in that region. This distinction protects the history from becoming a false race toward one final discovery. The central question is not answered by choosing a single fossil and declaring its owner the first Asian. Asia was reached at different times through different landscapes by populations whose identities changed as they separated and endured. The first humans in the East may therefore remain partly plural and partly unnamed. What the evidence gives us is not one founding face, but a layered human world that existed before ours, visible through stones without hands, bones without complete bodies, genes without communities, and landscapes whose oldest paths have vanished beneath earth and water. The history of humanity is often pictured as a ladder. One species stands on a lower step, another appears above it, and eventually Homo sapiens reaches the top. This image is easy to understand, but it does not match the evidence preserved across Asia. Human evolution was not a sequence in which one complete population waited for the next to replace it everywhere. It was a branching and reconnecting history. Populations separated when climate, distance, mountains, deserts, forests, and seas reduced contact. During isolation, their bodies and genetic histories changed. When routes opened again, some groups met related populations, exchanged genes, or occupied the same regions at different times. Other branches disappeared without leaving descendants that can now be detected. The result was not a ladder, but a network whose many lines have been broken. Homo erectus provides an early example of this complexity. Fossils placed within that broad name occur across immense distances and long periods, but they do not represent one unchanging population. Groups in Java, China, and Western Eurasia experience separate environments and could develop regional differences while retaining shared ancestry. Later, Denisovans and Neanderthals formed distinct populations, yet genetic evidence shows that their separation from Homo sapiens was not absolute. They had children with members of our species, and some of their ancestry continued into later generations. Their branches ended as independent populations, but portions of their biological history entered ours. This does not mean that all ancient humans blended into one group. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis remain distinct island populations with no confirmed genetic contribution to living people. Other Asian fossils may represent lineages that have not yet been connected securely to any named group. Some populations could have existed for thousands of generations and still leave only a tooth, a jaw, or a few tools. Human importance cannot be measured by the amount of evidence that happened to survive. The network also warns against words such as advanced and primitive when they are used as complete judgments about people. A population may retain a simple stone method because it remains effective, while developing knowledge in wood, plants, movement, social learning, or seasonal survival that leaves little archaeological trace. A small brain or unusual body does not place a human branch on a moral scale beneath another. Evolution does not aim toward greater dignity, intelligence, or resemblance to ourselves. It changes populations through inheritance, environment, selection, chance, and contact. Homo sapiens survived, but survival alone does not prove that every feature of our species was superior in every place. Larger populations, broad social connections, flexible behavior, favorable timing, and the absorption of useful inherited variation may all have contributed, while chance and local circumstances also mattered. The educational value of Asia's ancient record lies in this refusal to become a story of inevitable victory. Our species was not the goal toward which every earlier human was moving. We are one surviving outcome of a world that once contained several forms of humanity. Some of those forms were distant relatives. Some became ancestors through interbreeding, and some remain visible only as separate branches that ended. When we look for the first humans in the East, we are therefore not searching for failed versions of ourselves. We are recovering parts of a human network in which each population occupied its own present, responded to its own landscape, and carried possibilities that evolution did not preserve. Their disappearance narrowed the range of human bodies, histories, and adaptations existing on Earth. Recognizing that loss does not require imagining their thoughts or turning them into symbols. It requires only accepting what the evidence shows. Humanity was once plural, and the single surviving branch cannot represent every path the human family once followed. The first humans in Asia were not us, but the answer to who they were cannot be reduced to one name. Some of the earliest evidence belongs only to stone tools, preserving human activity without preserving the bodies that produced it. Later fossils reveal populations broadly described as Homo erectus, yet even that name contains regional histories that unfolded differently across China, Java, and other parts of Eurasia. Denisovan remains and genetic traces reveal another human presence stretching from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau and far beyond the few places where their bones have been identified. Flores and Luzon preserved island populations whose bodies followed separate paths under long isolation. Other skulls, jaws, and teeth from East Asia still sit between familiar categories not because they are meaningless, but because the human past was more connected and more diverse than the labels available to describe it. The question in the title, therefore, has a plural answer. Many kinds of humans reached the East before Homo sapiens, and some of them may remain unnamed. Yet the final lesson is not simply that several species once lived in Asia. It is that the history of human origins becomes less certain as it becomes more complete. Every new discovery fills one gap while revealing several others. A tooth can identify a distinctive population but leave the body unknown. A genome can reveal interbreeding but not the place or circumstances of the encounter. A stone tool can prove presence without preserving ancestry. A submerged coastline may conceal entire chapters that no excavation on dry land can reach. Scientific caution is not weakness in the face of these gaps. It is the method that prevents missing evidence from being replaced with stories that sound complete but are not supported. The early human world should not be made simpler merely because simplicity is easier to remember. Its value lies partly in teaching us how knowledge is built, through comparison, revision, disagreement, and the willingness to leave some questions open. Homo sapiens eventually became the only surviving human species, but our survival did not erase every connection with those who came before us. Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry remains inside many living populations. Some inherited variants became important under particular environmental conditions, while many others disappeared through chance or selection. This means that the boundary between their extinction and our survival is not perfectly clean. Parts of their biological history entered ours, even as their communities, relationships, and separate identities vanished. Other human branches may have left no known descendants at all. Their loss reduced the range of human forms that once existed, leaving one species to look backward through a record shaped by erosion, preservation, and accident. The first inhabitants of Asia should therefore not be remembered as failed attempts to become modern humans. They were populations adapted to their own landscapes, living within their own present without any obligation to resemble the future. Their tools, bones, proteins, and genes do not place them below us. They place us among them, as one late branch within a much older history. Beneath Asian cities, plateaus, forests, river sediments, caves, and shallow seas, there may still be evidence capable of changing how that history is understood. Some discoveries may give familiar fossils new identities. Others may reveal populations for which no name yet exists. The final map will never be complete, because most ancient lives left nothing that could survive until now. We can only follow the traces that remain, accept the silence between them, and remember that humanity once occupied the world in more than one form. If Asia still holds the bones, tools, and genetic echoes of people we have not yet recognized, then how many first humans of the East are still waiting beyond the edge of what we know?